Welcome back to the Regent Law Podcast. Today we're going to hear from Jonathan Wolfson, Chief Legal Officer and Policy Director at the Cicero Institute. Once again, he's interviewed by third-year law student Brian Stokey as part of our series on the administrative state. Enjoy!
All right. So starting off today, we have Jonathan Wolfson. He's the Chief Legal Officer and Policy Director at the Cicero Institute. Jonathan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Obviously, we're here for Regent School of Law's annual symposium. This year, it's about the administrative state and the effects that it has. But before we get into that, could you just give the listeners a little bit of background on how you got to where you're at now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did not assume that this was the path that I was going to take when I graduated undergrad from WashU in St. Louis. I was a kid who grew up in the Midwest and never expected I'd be living on the East Coast, and wound up getting really lucky. And one of my professors at WashU was Reagan's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And he called me into his office one day and said, "Hey, the CEA is hiring new junior staff and you should apply." And I did. And I don't know why they picked me, but for some reason I got to go work in the Bush administration right out of undergrad. Spent a couple years in DC doing that, and then went to law school at Virginia. And after that, clerked on the Fifth Circuit, wound up practicing in Richmond, Virginia for about 8 years. Got a phone call from a friend of mine who had also clerked on the Fifth Circuit while I was clerking, and he was working at the U.S. Department of Labor. And he said, "I know you aren't doing any labor law right now, but I know you know administrative law, and I think it'd be really fun if we could work together." And I pushed it off and took about a year of going back and forth, and ultimately decided it was a really good opportunity to go work in the executive branch and kind of play that role again. And so went and worked at the U.S. Department of Labor, spent about 18 months, 20 months in D.C. leading the policy shop. And after those 2 years, one of the guys who I'd worked for, he had left the Department of Labor to go to Cicero and help build the lobbying shop. And so he called me after the administration and said, "Hey, are you at all interested in coming and kind of splitting your time between doing legal work and policy work?" And suddenly I'm working for a national kind of state-focused think tank that's headquartered in Austin, Texas, and living in Richmond, Virginia.
What a cool story. And obviously, because of that background, you're going to have some insights into the topic that we're discussing today. For the listener, we're going to be using the word administrative state a lot. So could you briefly kind of explain what that buzzword means in a general sense?
Yeah. So, everybody in their civics class that hopefully they took in 8th grade and maybe again sometime in high school, or they just watch Schoolhouse Rock on YouTube if they're young, or on TV if they're older, they think there's 3 branches of government. You've got the executive branch that kind of administers the law and kind of executes what the laws are, the legislative branch that creates it, and the judicial branch that kind of decides what the law kind of is, not what it ought to be, but what it is. And there's really not a lot of discussion about what happens after that law gets passed. But the reality is, once a law gets passed, there is a massive bureaucracy that is in place that is intended to administer those laws. And the administrative state, the deep state, the bureaucracy, the unaccountable bureaucracy, all the terminology, all the buzzwords you may or may not hear, really refer to these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees at the federal government level and at the state government level who are not themselves elected, who are not even appointed by the elected officials, but are generally career staff whose job it is to do the everyday work. So if you pass a statute that says we're going to limit lead in paint because we're trying to protect kids, you're going to have federal agencies that are going to decide how much lead can be in that paint, because Congress didn't pass a law that said it has to be 1 part per billion lead. They just say limit it to make it safe. So you have to have an agency that comes in and then says, here's what that looks like. And so that's what the agencies are. The reason that people talk about them a lot more now than they did, say, 20, 30 years ago, or even than they did 100 years ago, is because the size of the government has grown significantly. And we are no longer at a spot where you have 10, 20, 100 people who work for a federal agency. You have 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people. The Department of Justice has almost 150,000 employees around the world, but that's a lot of people who are not in any way affiliated with the person who was elected president, with the people who the Senate has confirmed to be either the cabinet secretary or the kind of deputy level of secretaries in those agencies. You've got tons and tons of people whose jobs really are to administer the government. And then there's a big argument, and some of it's political, but some of it is just practical of what is the role of the administrative state, and ought they be out there kind of making the rules, or should they really just be trying to enforce the rules that are already on the books?
Thank you so much for that explanation. I had to watch the Schoolhouse Rock videos on DVD. I was in between the TV and the YouTube era, so I had to get it in the middle there. So you mentioned that you have some experience in that system that you've just described. So could you provide some perspective from, quote unquote, being on the inside of one of these administrative agencies, and kind of what that looks like to be part of that grand machine?
Yeah. So, and you're right. It is a grand machine. There is a lot of coordination that goes on between the White House and between the individual cabinet agencies. There's coordination that has to go on between those cabinet agencies and other cabinet agencies. So at the U.S. Department of Labor, where I was, we have some policy areas, for example, healthcare price transparency. Those regulations that came out were joint regulations between the U.S. Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Treasury, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So not only are you trying to figure out what maybe the White House and your cabinet agency want, you're having to figure out what the White House, your cabinet agency, and other cabinet agencies want to make sure that those policies are coordinated across the various agencies. And so on a day-to-day basis, what you're doing is you're looking at what are the rules and regulations on the books, what are the statutes that govern the agency and the laws that you're supposed to be administering, and are there gaps? Are there places that the regulated community, the businesses, the workers, the companies, other folks who are living under those regulations that you've created or that you're in charge of administering are having a hard time trying to figure out how to deal with? Or are there burdens that have been placed on them via regulation that really are unnecessary? So, for example, one of the things we did at the U.S. Department of Labor was to eliminate the need for pension plans to send out every year paper disclosure documents. So, you may have seen in the mail at some point in your life, or your parents or your grandparents, they would get these like 50, 100, 200 page documents, which are basically just an annual disclosure piece of paper that explains, like, here's all the, the types of ways we go about investing your pension funds, and here's who you have to contact if you have a concern. And, as the internet came out, there were some people who said, well, is there a way that maybe we could not mail out everyone who's in a member of one of these plans a copy of their disclosure? And so we put together a regulation that we finalized, and that ultimately meant that individuals were able to opt out of receiving these things via paper. Well, as a result, the businesses were able to save about $5 billion. And so these are just a burden that was placed on those businesses. Good reason. The disclosures themselves, really good documents, really important that people have access to those. But if you have the ability to access those online and have permanent access, instead of having the massive stack of paper that for most households gets thrown in the recycle bin, this actually seems like a better plan for everybody. The only people who didn't like it were the companies who were in charge of printing all the documents, because some of those printing companies were pretty upset that they were going to lose access to this business model.
That makes sense to me. So that seems like a positive, right? That comes from the administrative state. You were able to tailor make this regulation. You saw a problem, addressed it, and were able to fix it by changing that regulation. So that's a positive. Are there drawbacks to making decisions at such a high level from such a large organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the challenges is that the regulations that get written don't have to be related to the laws that just got passed. And so if there's been a law in the books, for example, at the Department of Labor, we oversaw when I was there, the implementation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act was written in the 1930s. It's been amended a couple of times since, but most of the regulating that we were doing when I was at the Department of Labor through the Wage and Hour Division, which oversees the implementation and all the enforcement of the obligations that businesses have under the Fair Labor Standards Act, almost everything we were doing was based on statutes that were decades old. And so that doesn't mean that the agency doesn't have the authority to do that, but it does mean that agencies have a lot of discretion. And so as a result, the agencies can step in and implement their policy preferences based on old statutes that may or may not have been intended to affect those things. So for example, we put in place an independent contractor rulemaking. Well, in the 1930s, there really wasn't a concept of independent contracting. It doesn't mean there weren't people who were independent contractors, but the rise of the gig economy, the rise of working from home, all of those things that really are much more modern, those weren't contemplated in the 1930s when they were writing the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so independent contracting is not defined in the statute. As a result, we are having to find a way to explain how an individual is excluded from the obligations under the Fair Labor Standards Act because they're an independent contractor. That's a much harder process, and it requires an agency to go through a lot of work, but it also leaves opportunity for agencies to take actions that the legislature may not want them to take, and that a lot of individuals who are in the regulated community might have concerns about.
And I think what you just described, I'm thinking of an issue where from administration to administration, you might see, these laws that were passed in the 30s, you see quick, lots of quick back and forth. Would that be true?
Absolutely. No. So, when my team left the Department of Labor, the political appointees from the Trump administration left and the political appointees for the Biden administration walked in the door, one of the first things that administration did was pause any regulations that we had put in place that they still had the ability to pause because of timeline. So there are some regulations that have effective dates extended out a certain period of time after they're finalized. And so some of those effective dates were after the change of administration. And so one of the first actions that they took, and this isn't unique to Democrat administrations, one of the first actions the Trump administration took when it walked in the door was to pause any regulations that were not yet final by the prior administration. So this is a normal behavior, but it is definitely for the regulated community a challenge, because now as a business, you're trying to decide, are the regulations that are being issued going to be permanent? Am I going to live under these forever? Am I going to be ping-ponged back and forth between having to do what one side of the aisle wants me to do or what the other side wants me to do? Or are there even just going to be different enforcement priorities from one administration to the next? And that can also be a change, right? So even if the regulations themselves stay exactly the same, if the agency says, we're really going to worry a lot about whether or not women are getting maternity benefits, and that's going to be the thing that we're going to spend all of our energy on, that's going to change the way that the agency enforces the laws in place, even though they still have the exact same laws on the books. And so it does change a lot from administration to administration. And, I think one thing that conservatives more than liberals complain about, but I think that both sides complain about, is kind of misuse of the administrative state by those agencies kind of changing the rules. One of the places that really does take a big role for most people who are looking at this is kind of taking the big step back and saying, going back to our Schoolhouse Rock example, if the people who are making the rules and regulations are directly connected to whomever was elected president, there's some political accountability, right? If the Secretary of Energy puts forward and signs her name to a regulation that bans gas-powered vehicles, the voters can say to the president, we don't want that regulation in place and we want to step in and try to stop it. And ultimately, there's some political accountability. Unfortunately, a lot of regulation work that gets done is not done by the senior-most people, in part just because of bandwidth. There's going to be a couple hundred political appointees in agencies of tens of thousands of people. And so a lot of the work is being done not by the people who are directly part of the political administration, but are actually part of that kind of career group of bureaucrats who are going to always be there. And so one question starts to come up of, who is actually running these agencies? Are they the people at the very top who are who officially the average voter assumes is running the agency? Or are there separate divisions that are actually being run pretty much entirely by career staff who have pretty much no accountability to the voters? Because even if you were to get rid of the president, those people's jobs stay exactly the same. So that really is the place where most of the complaints about the administrative state come down.
It's a scary concept when you have an organization with tens of thousands of individuals that almost are completely insulated from that political accountability. So obviously, when we make laws, we want some enforcement behind them. So what should the role of the administrative state be? What are administrative agencies good for?
Yeah. Well, so go back to that example about lead paint from earlier. I think that administrative agencies do have some technical expertise usually inside that maybe the legislators don't themselves have. Legislators could bring some of that expertise to themselves if they wanted to, but a lot of times the legislation isn't clearly drafted with all the specifics laid out. And so there is a need for somebody to step in and to provide kind of the nuances of, hey, you have to make staircases safe, right? That's what an OSHA law might say. Staircases have to be safe. Well, what is a safe staircase? Does it talk about the depth of the steps? Is it talking about marking them in dark spaces? All of those sorts of things that Congress may not put into a statute. And so it does help to have an agency that can work with the regulated community to say what is and what is not a safe step, or what is not lead-based paint. All of those sorts of things. It does make some sense to have a regulatory agency that can step in and do that. Generally, what you want regulatory agencies to do is to enforce the rules. You want them to not make the rules, you want them to enforce them. And so if Congress says we don't want lead-based paint, and there's an agency that's in charge of regulating it, and somebody produces paint that contains too much lead, then you want the agency to step in and either stop the production or force them to not sell it, however they want to go about it, issuing fines, however you want the administrative agency to do that, much more than you want them redefining something like safe paint. And in reality, far too often what Congress passes is not, we don't want lead-based paint. What Congress passes is a statute that says we want safe paint. Well, safe paint can be really, really varied in how it gets defined. And so that gives so much discretion to the agencies to decide where along that continuum. Is it just lead? Are there all these other additives and chemicals? What all can be included in paint to be safe or unsafe? And if you don't provide any clarity, then the business community that's being regulated is going to have a really hard time complying without the agency stepping in and providing that guidance. However, once they provide that guidance, often then it really is not being the law made by Congress and the president. It's the law being made by that executive agency by itself.
That makes sense. I really appreciate that insight, because I think that oftentimes the administrative state, we use it so often in the negative context, it's hard to figure out, why do we even have this? Why do we need it? And so I think that explanation kind of provides context for in the enforcement side of things, and why we still need some administrative action to make boots on the ground and make sure the laws are enforced.
Well, and I think that you want laws to be enforced, right? The reality is people who obey the laws need the laws to be enforced, because if their competitors in the marketplace aren't abiding by the law, they're getting a competitive advantage. For example, if you have a business that doesn't provide the Fair Labor Standards Act required minimum wage to their employee, then that's going to be competitively harmful to the other company, right? So if you have a company that's flouting the law, if you have a company that says, you know what, we're going to produce paint that we know contains way too much lead because it's cheaper for us. We don't care if it has negative consequences. We don't care if it's against the law. We're pretty sure we can get away with it. The company that's following the rules and maybe had to spend extra money to stay within the law is going to be competitively harmed. And so you want the law to be equally applied to everyone. And so you want enforcement agencies to enforce the law. The thing you don't want enforcement agencies to do is to create laws themselves. And that really is where the challenge becomes most apparent in the regulatory state. And that's really where most people have a concern, is where you have a regulatory agency that is able to issue regulations without ever going to the political appointees. And they start putting out these regulations, whether it's through the notice and comment regulatory process or through sub-regulatory guidance. Either one of those ways where suddenly businesses believe that they have to act in a particular way, regardless of whether that actually has gone through any process to be created in a proper way.
So looking at that problem of regulation and addressing the issue of the expanded, administrative state, would you mind speaking to what you're working on a little bit at Cicero? I know that you're pretty passionate about healthcare reform and employment policies. And so how does the administrative state affect what you do on the day-to-day?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So at the Cicero Institute, we focus on state policies, not really on federal policies. And so one of the things some people will ask me is they'll say, well, if you're worried about state policies, why do you care about the administrative state? The administrative state is this behemoth in Washington, D.C. But the reality is, while there are tens of thousands of pages of regulations in the Federal Register, every state in the United States has about 130,000 regulations individually in their state on average. And so that means that not only do you have the massive Federal Register of regulations that every business, that every family, that every household has to try to live under, but in every single state you have unique regulations that those states have themselves. And this only becomes more complicated if you're a business that operates in multiple states, because now you're trying to abide by the Virginia regulations, the North Carolina regulations, and the Maryland regulations, in addition to all the federal regulations. And so you're adding hundreds of thousands of additional obligations on top. And so at Cicero, we focus on a lot of areas of policy, like you mentioned, healthcare, focus on workforce. One of the interesting areas in workforce that we've had an opportunity to work on is an elimination of unnecessary college degree requirements for state employment jobs. And there's a lot of states that have required, in order to be kind of mid-level management jobs, you have to have a college degree, when the reality is lots of people have the skills they need for those jobs, but don't actually have the college degree piece of paper. And we've got great stories. There's other organizations that we've partnered with who have great stories of people who literally were told, in order to get a promotion, you have to get a college degree. They went and found the cheapest or fastest degree they possibly could get. It didn't have any relevance to the job they were going to try to do, but they just needed to do it because they wanted to advance their career. And that's not really a wise way to do things. Some of that's statutory, some of it's regulatory, some of it's just kind of the administrative state larding itself up with its own kind of internal regulations. But that's one area. And we've worked with a number of states kind of on trying to create regulatory reforms in their states to do things like, say, sunsetting their regulations every 5 to 10 years, where all the regulations that are on your books have to sunset. You have to look over them every 5, 10 years, 15 years. Make sure those are the regulations you actually want to keep on the books. You know, the other day we were looking and we found that in Texas, in order to have any sort of horse racing operation on your facility, you have to have a dedicated fax machine that can communicate with the state. Well, that was probably fine when they put it in place, but the reality is the likelihood that anybody's going to be faxing back and forth with the state regulator about what's going on the horse racing track is probably pretty low here in the 21st century. And unfortunately, there are dozens and dozens of regulations in Texas and in states across the country that are still requiring people to do things like fax things. There's still requirements that people tape record meetings, which, while having a recording of a meeting is a great idea, I don't think it has to be on a cassette tape. I think that there's probably other ways, you know, including the way that we're recording this podcast, that you could permanently preserve the meeting agenda and all of the things that were said, probably in a much more secure and safe fashion as well.
I have to be careful because a lot of my terminology is outdated too. I'm constantly in trouble for using books on tape, and that's not what we have anymore. It's audiobooks. So I have to get with it. Apparently, so do a fair amount of states when they're looking at their policies. So I guess transitioning to a couple more personal questions. What was your experience like in law school? Did you imagine that you'd be doing this when you got out? Was it policy what you were really interested in when you were at University of Virginia?
Yeah. So I never expected that I was going to be back in a significant policy role. I really enjoyed policy when I was working in the Bush administration. I found it fascinating. I loved law school, had a great time. And I think that I fully expected I was going to practice law for most of my career and, might do things here and there. Kind of expected at some point I might have an opportunity to go back in government, but in kind of a law and policy combined role, and then figured I would end up back in private practice or, doing the practice of law day to day as kind of what I would do. So if you'd have told me this is what I was going to do, I'd have kind of been surprised, but I've been really grateful that this is the path that I took. And I think that I have found an opportunity to use the legal skills and legal training that I have in a really important way. You have to, if you understand the law, it's much easier to do policy. And I think that policy has massive impacts on people's everyday lives. And I've really enjoyed getting to work in the state policy field. I really would have kind of assumed when I was in law school, if I was doing policy, I'd be working pretty much back in the federal space because that's what I'd started my career doing. Mm-hmm. But, one of the things you see in the state policy versus in federal policy, because state legislators are so much closer to the citizens who they're legislating about, they really are looking for opportunities to get important things done. And that's not just to check a box to get something done to get it done, but they really are trying to think about how will this affect the real people who they're interacting with at the grocery store, at church, at a soccer game on a daily basis. Because a lot of these legislatures, these folks are part-time. They're going to go back to their businesses, going to go back to coach their kids' little league team. they're going to interact with the people whose lives they're affecting by the policies. And so, whereas some of the folks in DC, they never really have to interact with that. And to be frank, that's one of the challenges in the administrative state, is that a lot of the people in the administrative state themselves are never going to live under the regulations that they've created, or they won't see that they're living under those regulations they've created. But at the state level, there really are opportunities to get things done, because those legislators understand that everything they're doing has real faces and real names behind who's going to be helped and who's going to be harmed.
What would you say to a law student who hears what you just said and is fired up, and, whether they attend symposium or they're listening to the other talks from today and they want to get more involved? What would you say to the budding 1L or 2L that is passionate about reform and wanting to get involved in that type of policy?
Yeah. So I'd say two things. One is continue to learn to be the best lawyer you can be, because I really do think that having solid legal skills makes you better, even if you want to focus your entire career on policy. I think that understanding the nuances of the law, understanding how to carefully read a statute, how to carefully read a case, how to understand, if we create a policy that does this, here's how it's going to navigate the court system. That's all really important to being able to make good policy. So if they're interested in policy, still want to be a really good lawyer, build some legal experience and background. But secondly, look for opportunities to kind of stretch that policy muscle while you're in law school. And one of the ways, and I'll throw in a plug for Cicero, we have a Law and Policy Fellows program where we invite law students, grad students, business school students, med students to come and spend about 10 hours a week working with us on policy work. It's not legal focused, it's kind of policy focused, but it's a great opportunity to really understand how policy is built, how it's kind of done on the inside of a think tank at the state level. And again, I think working at the state level, there's just a lot of great opportunity to get something done. But I think that that's another good way for them to really have some practical policy experience in the midst of their law school experience.
Thank you for that advice. And, like you said, Cicero is out there. And, if you're in the Austin area, or, apparently Richmond. But I appreciate your time. Is there anything else about the administrative state that you need to leave with us?
So I think something important for everybody to remember is the administrative state is, while it's a problem in many ways, it's a problem that Congress created, and Congress should not get away with just being able to point a finger at the administrative state. If Congress wanted to, they could write really clear statutes and leave very little wiggle room for the agencies to regulate. That doesn't excuse the agencies for taking all that authority they get. I mean, I always say to people when I give talks for organizations that regulators regulate, the same as like litigators litigate. People who think of themselves as regulators, that's what they look at a statute and they think, how can I regulate using this statute? Mm-hmm. And so you've given that opening to those regulators as a legislator. But I think it's important for us to recognize that everybody plays a role here, and that we as voters and citizens should not only be trying to get involved to help influence the regulations that are being written, but also should be getting involved with our legislators and saying to them, we expect more out of you. Don't just write the simplest high-level piece of legislation. Write a piece of legislation that really does constrain the administrative state from being able to do just whatever they want to do.
Makes a lot of sense. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us here on the Regent Law Review Symposium podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great time.
All right.